Fear will keep the local systems in line.
Your sad devotion to that ancient religion has not helped you conjure up the stolen data tapes.
I find your lack of faith disturbing.
I'm starting my own religion.
I'm sorry, what?
I'm calling it mathology. The only sin in mathology is being stupid.
Where the hell's this god of yours?
It's funny Lieutenant Dan said that, because right then, God showed up.
It's time for a showdown! You and me! I'm right here! Come and get
Shabbat Shalom. Welcome, Bruchim Aba'im. I'm Rabbi Paul, your virtual rabbi. You found Beit Virtuali. Let's stir up a little Torah together, starting with some of my least favorite thoughts, words, sentences, phrases like, don't criticize God. Take it on faith. Am I still the only one inside religion, rather than throwing stones from outside, that finds these things distasteful? Well, something tells me that if you are watching this, the answer is no. But let's spend a little time in this headspace nonetheless, otherwise our crisis of faith might just look a little too much like Lieutenant Dan's. First of all, an acknowledgement. Beit Virtuali's audience is a surprising mixture of Jews from across the religious and secular spectrum, which is awesome, and non-Jews from across the religious secular spectrum, which has been for me a surprise, but is just as awesome. The mixture of traditions can, however, lead to linguistic confusion, conceptual confusion through language. Once on an airplane flying from Chicago to Seattle, many years ago, before this hat was a rabbinical hat and not just a nice chapeau, the middle seat companion to my aisle seat saw my yarmulke as an open invitation to a conversation that tried to awkwardly juxtapose curiosity and proselytization. I believe strongly in being the best ambassador to Judaism possible, even when quite annoyed at any level by proselytizing. And the conversation continued with some level of mutuality, right up until the point that my row companion exclaimed, loud enough on an airplane to turn heads and stop conversation, "What? There's no place in Judaism for grace?" I tried explaining without success that grace, as she was using the word, applied to the Christian faith, and the word fell outside of normativity in Judaism. If one accepts the dictionary definition applying grace to Christianity as free and unmerited favor of God as manifested in the salvation of sinners and the bestowing of blessings, then no, grace is not a Jewish concept. We have in Judaism a process of mitzvot, coupled with a ritual tradition that moves toward an underlying ethic of recognizing where we have messed up and doing the work to make it right. Our High Holy Day liturgy encapsulates this with the concept that God cannot forgive you for a sin committed against a fellow human. We've got work to do, and it's quite practical. I tried without success to explain that each of our religions tried to reach the divine through varying paths, and that this was okay. God was big enough for both of us. I found no more success when attempting to talk about Judaism's unique vocabulary, and then with my best interfaith kippah on, tried to discuss commonalities. The moment, however, that I did not share a belief based on a specific understanding of a single word, even her desire to convert me disappeared into the unpleasant silence and aggressively crossed arms that testified to her opinion of my religion for the rest of the flight. Quite frankly, I was fine. I'd remained calm, surprisingly, and patient, and I had a great book in my backpack. I'm not sure that she had such a pleasant flight. The greater point, however, is that a lot of questions I get sent to me on this channel reflect words that are more tied into the vocabulary of the dominant Christian culture than the quite different words that reflect Semitic linguistic tradition and the unique religious traditions that flow out of such language. Just for one simple quick example, we translate Kodesh as holy, but if we believe that Kodesh means holy, then we're interpreting Judaism through a Christian lens rather than through a Jewish lens, even if the one doing this interpretation is occasionally Jewish. This is not meant to be an insult by any means. It's actually a predictable result of less focus being placed in many corners of the Jewish world on Hebrew education. It's also a result of what our mother tongue is. Those born in lands that are most likely to watch this video probably speak more fluent English than Hebrew, and therefore think as well in English rather than Hebrew. Holy, along with words like grace, faith, sin, and oh my goodness, even God have at times radically different connotations in Semitic languages than in Indo-European, and it should be obvious that for many of us the default words and thoughts will be those which comes from our native tongue. Well, the sole exception is perhaps schlep. Unsurprisingly, this is not exactly something that came out in many congregational sermons. It's something that I have only been able to address in conversion courses where my audience is slightly more captive. In a standard sermon, in a standard congregation, there are not many ways that this cannot and will not be taken personally. Nonetheless, Judaism has the right to be its own religion, seen through its own rich tradition, including language, and part of making this happen is wrestling with the at times subtle shifts and at times massive chasms between Jewish concepts and the English words into which they are interpreted and through which we do our divine wrestling. There's a nice example of this right at the beginning of Parashat Chukat, although you must get into the classical commentaries in order to hit it head on. Chukat, which for you grammar nerds is only half of the compound word Chukat Torah, translates as some semantic set of statute, regulation, prescription, enactment, limit, and ordinance. Chok is often set in Torah texts next to mishpatim, which more directly translates into laws. This could quickly become a complex discussion in desperate need of a weed whacker, but the oversimplified explanation is that a mishpat, or a law, is adjudicated by a shofet, a human judge, whereas a chok, regulation, is set and judged by the eternal. For the first one, you need a law book. For the second one, well, some people might say you need faith. Not me, but some people. This sort of dichotomy can be found in multiple places and time periods throughout Jewish history and the evolution of Jewish law. Those who like to mock such things as stoning in Torah law, for example, might be disappointed to know that there is scholarly doubt if such a literal punishment was ever used. And certainly, by the time we get to the Talmud, the sages use two of the most extreme penalties in the Torah, skila, stoning, and keret, being cut off from the eternal, as the general categories of that which is punishable by us and that which is punishable by the eternal, respectively. My apologies then to the folks that wish to read only the surface while assuming the possibilities of the worst of intentions and interpretations. The thing that I wish to focus on is the use of Chukat Torah as it refers to the strange chok, the regulation, the prescription, the enactment of the para aduma, the red heifer. In another nutshell, the red heifer is the required sacrifice for creating the ashes necessary to purify someone who is ritually impure due to having come in physical contact to a human corpse. Of course, the head-scratching fun begins immediately, as the very act of making the purifying agent renders one ritually impure. The near impossibility of finding a cow that meets the specifics required by this given by the eternal statute adds another layer of shrugged shoulders to the logic behind the divine pronouncement. Perhaps extremely so. According to the Mishnah, where there is an entire tractate dedicated to this mitzvah, there were only 9 ever in total found and used in the time starting from Moses up until the destruction of the Second Temple. Let's call that 1,300 years, give or take. We're not the only ones left scratching our heads. As so much in the Torah law relies on ritual purity, one would think that the process to re-purify would fall into the category of merely hard rather than essentially impossible. All this together brings us to the crux of our discussion, the answer we keep on finding from post-head-scratching sages who state similarly to Rashi, it is an enactment from before me, the eternal. You have no right to criticize it. The way this comes down, and is often, but thank goodness not always taught, is that although much of Jewish tradition makes sense, some things do not. And those things, if you will pardon the expression, we will just have to take on faith. Now, acknowledging the little bit of straw manning that I've done here, I'm not trying to explore the amazingly complex and fascinating answers and interpretations that you can find with a little effort from all possible streams in Judaism. What I'm more concerned about is the thing that has caused so many of my listeners and readers to have left organized religion, that someone at some point said to them some variation of,
"You have no right to ask that question."
Sometimes that's even spoken in a Darth Vader-esque sort of way. Inquisitive minds with bad teachers, or Sith Lords for teachers, have a way of finding themselves bitterly outside formal religious walls. And as rabbinical Judaism is utterly and at its essence a religion of dialogue, this is a special travesty. Still, Rashi, one of our greatest of the greatest, does reflect this no right to question attitude in this case. Others repeat this, and it's part of the collective consciousness of Judaism, so it needs to be addressed. Now, an important part of how I'm approaching this, it's also something that makes me personally furious. And so I'm going to offer the iterative chapter for this video way before the end of the video. Here it is. What are the elements of our tradition that make you mad enough that you do not want to discuss them, read anything more about them, deal with them at all? You see, this is a huge issue on multiple levels. Reading Rashi's words, "You have no right to criticize it," puts me immediately in my personal place of righteous anger. I feel like I've spent my entire career trying to get people back into Judaism who left because of someone saying words like this to them, ignoring for the moment that righteous anger itself is reserved in Jewish law for the eternal. The effect of this anger is the desire to do the rabbinical version of, well, I'll show them. And seriously, Rashi, of blessed memory, is no longer with us, so I'm not even sure who I'm trying to show. Rashi was anyway quoting an earlier tradition in the Talmud, where a lot of folks, certainly of blessed memory and certainly not show-upable, entered in this dialogue. What I do know is that upon encountering this Rashi in rabbinical school while preparing for a sermon at my student pulpit, I pulled out all the stops to do exactly what Rashi said I shouldn't and came up with a plausible explanation for the unexplainable. I one-upped Maimonides and made the rational out of the not rational. I don't even remember what it was that I said, but I'm pretty sure I missed the point. My assumption was that old gray-haired folks from way back then wanted to make sure far less wise blokes like me would never question the things that they phrased in their peculiar ways to hide the fact that they just made it up. Much like a young adolescent who has recently made the ubiquitous discovery that their parents couldn't possibly have ever known or learned anything in their entire lives, and therefore were not to be a trusted source of information, I assume that the sages of the past were only worthy of being the sounding board for my personal cleverness, most of which had incidentally been won via the painstaking process of asking Rabbi Google, rather than sitting down in a library or lecture hall or with a chavruta and learning in a way that meant I earned what I learned. It's probably why I don't remember what I said in that sermon. Worst of all, I did exactly what I'm constantly warning others against doing. I took something that bothered me on the surface and used that as an excuse to assume the worst and made no attempt to interpret symbolically, allegorically, or mystically. I became the exact thing that I most often rail about in my writing. It's really not hard, unsurprisingly, to start pulling out wisdom when we move away from feeding only the worst tendencies of our egos. Think about it. We encounter all the time things that don't make sense on the surface. The Torah itself doesn't say we cannot wrestle with God. Quite the opposite, in fact, as our very tribal name, Bnei Israel, implies wrestling with the divine. Let's just purely speculate and say for a moment that there was a lost historical, logical, or even political reason that the Para Aduma existed. Perhaps, remember, I'm having some fun with speculation here, early in the formation of Levitical law, farmer Biff ben Shmulek had been especially kind to an itinerant priest. Such things existed and are clearly captured in the Book of Judges. Now, being an itinerant priest connotes no permanent home and suggests relying on the kindness of strangers. If you go for a while with no kindness and quite possibly not much food, a kind soul will be remembered. Well, farmer Biff ben Shmulek also happened to have a prize bull with great seed that bred true, and this farmer and this bull were a reliable source for red cows. Itinerant priest Dodo ben Merari, several years later, gets invited to serve at one of the, at that time, way more than one temple to the Eternal. Even the Tanakh acknowledges 3. And as Dodo has had so much practical experience in the field, kind of important, ends up rising quickly in the priestly hierarchy until he's able to institute an SOP that requires all cows used for purification ash comes from Biff ben Shmulek. Now, how many generations before the origins of that SOP are lost? Standard operating procedure. After a few generations, where everyone talks about these red heifers as if it is the word of God, God's self, who are the later generations to dare question? How many things are done in our communities today that we later find out have nothing to do with Jewish law and our local tradition? Minhag hamakom. If you answer none, it means either you are not visiting enough other shuls or you are not paying attention. More communities are led by the tyranny of their minhag than they are from a straight reading of the Shulchan Aruch. Try changing a favorite community tradition, even if it contradicts halakha. I dare you. Is it any surprise that by the time we get to the sages, that the items lost in history would cause a little consternation? The narrative device, the obvious narrative device of the Torah, is to place our entire continuum of inspiration into the mouth of Moses speaking the will of the Eternal. Even if some of those items were part of a much longer development of ideas by multiple groups for a variety of reasons. At the end of the day, much of Judaism is rational, at least from one time perspective or another, although much even from today's perspective. How much of a shock it must be if you're a sage, you spent your entire life literally memorizing every word of the Tanakh in addition to other Jewish texts, can discuss rational reasons behind nearly everything, and yet still stumble upon a few things that just don't add up. For that sage, the original farmer Biff Ben Shmulik has been of blessed memory so long that there's no way the original reasons for this or that ordinance would be remembered. The Torah, as a teacher, like every tradition that survives the test of time, is able to take wisdom and tribal tradition and package it in a way that's easy to remember. Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, the Eternal spoke to Moses saying, is a shorthand for a lot of forgotten backstory. If the final version of the mitzvah carried forward makes sense, well, no harm, no foul. If the final version is one of those very few that still cause the head scratch, well, it's sure tempting to say things like, you have no right to criticize it, especially if you are used to coming up with good answers, and in this case cannot. And yet there are two final layers of wisdom that Chukat seems to be teasing out as the wall of righteous anger gets replaced by the only possible antidote to it: curiosity. For example, how about we meditate on the question, are there times where we have no right to criticize something? The Talmud method here is to draw lines at the absurd extremes to make a point and gain initial consensus. A rabbi creating that absurd extreme might say, does a 3-month-old human, for example, get to make choices regarding which mutual funds the family invests in as part of their 401k? Yes, I truly hope we are all rolling our eyes at the absurdity of the question. We make decisions on behalf of that infant, and we may even be influenced through the existence of that child to choose this sort of fund as opposed to that sort of fund. But holding out a piece of paper and choosing a fund based on a poor motor skill, gooey pointed index finger is neither rational nor practical. It may make a great John Cage-esque composition, but I digress. The infant has neither capacity nor agency to make this or pretty much any decision. And as a result, we have evolved at the genetic and societal level structures that acknowledge this. Just think of school for one obvious example. The next exercise then is to move that age slider forward and start seeing which decisions can be made, when and why. For a while, there's still no debate. It's still all absurd. But then at a certain age, debate will begin. And at various different ages, different debates begin, reflected far later down the slider in such things as drinking age, voting age, and finally the last and greatest of all, ability to rent a car. You 24.5-year-olds know what I'm talking about, am I right? Whether we like it or not, the contemporary expression of laws and regulations, mishpatim uchokim, contain the same inherent mixture of ideas. Some make sense on the surface, some are logically derivable, and some make us scratch our heads. The trick for the last, and my personal lesson from my personal asking of the iterative question this week, is acknowledging that when the meaning and purpose of something is closed to me, I don't understand it. That doesn't necessarily make it silly or useless. Maybe it is arbitrary, and I don't like the arbitrary, but maybe it just means I have not grasped it yet. Outside of ultra-Orthodoxy, this is the essence of living in relationship to Jewish law. Just read Soloveitchik's The Halakhic Man. On the one side of the continuum, we can see the mitzvot as inherently valid, something to do as we assume there is an as-of-yet undiscovered positive and elevation purpose. On the other side, we can assume halacha comes purely from either the arbitrary or the non-relevant past, and wait to embrace a mitzvah until we've reached a point where we have begun to apprehend the purpose. The short version is, I will either do it until there's a reason not to, or I will not do it until I find a reason that I should. This is the central divide among streams, and if you've made it this far in life, and you're still in any level of dialogue with the mitzvot, it's part of your personal journey, like it or not. Being conscious of where you fall on that continuum and why might be important work for all of us to undertake. The wisdom of the red heifer and the later head-scratching she caused seems to be that we need a little humility. None of us is a finished product, and that is especially true regarding knowledge. We will continue to be exposed to things that offer the opportunity to learn, whether we choose to learn or not, and part of that journey will include voices from the past or present that say, listen, but don't question, using language of other religions. Some things you just have to take on faith. Even in this truly annoying statement, at least to me, there's a balance to be explored. If I am told to sit down and shut up, I will not take it well. I do not expect you to take it well, and I'm going to wish to have words regarding respect and pedagogy with the person saying this. Simultaneously, we are surrounded at this moment, regardless of our age, education, or accumulated wisdom, with stuff we don't know. Perhaps the stuff is not our expertise, or perhaps we've just encountered the blessing of someone who knows more about something than we do. Such creatures do exist. Either way, the Red Heifer and Rashi may just be asking in this moment to wait to claim that we are the world's greatest expert in something, in anything, until we've allowed ourselves to listen and learn a little more. At least enjoy the thought of how calm and quiet social media would be in such a world. Shabbat Shalom, everyone. We'll see you next time.
בחצות זרות